The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. National security expert Richard Clarke explains why experts are so frequently ignored by policymakers on life and death issues. Political blogger Dante Chinni, who studies political division in red and blue America, says Trump voters are not getting the short end of the economic stick, but it's shorter than it used to be. And the mayor of Louisville, Kentucky, talks with Bill Press about community policing and health care. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Richard Clarke, an intelligence and defense expert in several administrations, says the biggest threat to national security is global warming. And we say hello to Richard Clarke, veteran of 30 years in national security, over a decade in the White House, now the CEO of a cybersecurity consulting firm. He's also the author of 8 books. The newest, with co-author R.P. Eddy, is called Warnings, Finding Cassandras to Stop Catastrophes. Richard Clarke, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Yeah, it's good to be back with you.
Nice to have you with us as well. You and your co-author, R.P. Eddy, list case study after case study of natural and man-made disasters that were predicted by experts but ignored by those in charge. What, if anything, do they have in common?
Well, they all have in common that there was an expert who was data-driven, who was an outlier from the other experts, who saw something before the other experts did, or saw something with more clarity than the other experts did. And that expert was rejected because what she or he was predicting had never happened before, seemed very outlandish, would require a huge response that would cost money and change the way we do things, and therefore they were ignored and ridiculed. And then the catastrophe happened.
One of your fascinating explanations as to why expert predictions of failure are ignored is something called the initial occurrence syndrome. Please explain what that means in terms of disaster preparation.
So the initial occurrence syndrome just simply means it's never happened before. The thing that you are predicting, the thing that you are telling your boss or the president or the president of your company about is something that they've never encountered. No one's ever encountered. And even though we know intellectually that every day we run up against things that have never happened before, that's what the world is, constantly evolving, constantly new things, somehow deep in our psyche, we have a reaction that says, I don't want this thing to happen. I don't want to be bothered with this thing. Chances are it won't happen because I don't want it to happen. I'll just be an ostrich, put my head in the sand, and hope it won't happen. And I've got a good excuse for doing that because it's never happened before. And if anybody blames me after the fact on the odd chance that it does occur, I'll just say, how could I possibly have worried about that? It had never happened before.
Mm-hmm. You know, as an expert in national security with all of your years, I'm now just recognizing, I guess, what would be considered another block in your job sometimes, and having to, you know, when you go to somebody in leadership and you say, hey, look, here's this problem that's going to happen. What do you have to do what more can you do to try and convince them that, look, we have to at least look into it? At least do the bare minimum.
Very often my problem was to sound rational and reasonable and not overly excited. I had to work at, when I had something that I thought was terrible and was about to happen, I had to work at sounding calm and reasonable and somewhat doubting that it might happen, but saying, listen, boss, the prudential thing to do and the thing that you want the record to show is that you looked into it and you took the necessary mitigating steps.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that President Trump is getting that type of advice from anybody? And quite frankly, does it matter?
I doubt it. He seems to spend all of his time watching cable TV and tweeting. I don't know when he'd have the time to worry about the future or planning. And I'm not sure he's terribly receptive to it. He's just gives every evidence of not being intellectually curious. And he doesn't show any sign of being fact-driven. So unless it shows up on Breitbart, maybe if Breitbart wrote a story about some warning, he might pay attention to it.
Well, here's something that they'll write about, but not in the way we'd want it to anyway. Global warming. It sounds to me like one of the great existential threats that has been warned about quite loudly, but still ignored or denied. Is there doubt about the science? And isn't the question really not the science, but about how to respond to it?
Well, we have a chapter in the book about it, and it focuses on Jim Henson, the great climate scientist, formerly at NASA, now at Columbia University. Jim was the guy who back in the late 80s first started focusing attention on climate change and the CO2 contribution to that. And he was a Cassandra at the time. The government tried to suppress him, the Bush administration. We now know he was right. Everyone in the business understands that. All climate scientists agree. But we focus on him in the book not because of his past role as a Cassandra, but as his current role. Because today, Jim Henson is an outlier in predicting sea level rise as a result of climate change. The UN says there will be 1 meter rise in the sea globally by the year 2100. Henson says it could be between 6 and 9 meters. That's an enormous difference. If the sea level rises between 18 and 27 feet, we'll lose half of Florida. We'll lose most of our coastal cities. Countries like Bangladesh, a country of 100 million people, will go mainly underwater. That is a Cassandra warning like none other that I've ever seen.
Is this the kind of thing that you change the narrative just to get people to perhaps look at something in a different way? In other words, let's not call it global warming. Let's just talk about the fact that it's pollution that you're breathing. I think of the coal miners and how Trump promised all these great jobs, which we're going away from coal. We have been going away from coal for many years now. Do you black lung you can't deny, and so is that some way to perhaps get some of these deniers, these people that refuse to believe, to maybe turn a little bit and don't call it something else? I mean mask it with some way.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. If you focus on consequences, for example, if you focus on sea level rise, it's already happening in Miami. You can see it happening. In Norfolk, Virginia, you can see it happening. You go to those cities on days of the full moon, and at high tide, the full moon conditions creating floods already in those cities on a regular basis. I think if we say, don't call it climate change, call it sea level rise, and say we need to start getting ready for sea level rise. And you say to all the Republicans in Florida, your property is going to be worthless. That message might get through to them.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Richard Clarke, CEO of cybersecurity consulting firm. Of course, 30 years in national security, over a decade in the White House. His latest book with co-author R.P. Eddy is called Warnings, Finding Cassandras to Stop Catastrophes. And you list any number of lone voices in the wilderness who warned of disaster and were not heeded. Is there a general conclusion you can make about why they weren't listened to, or does this go back to initial occurrence syndrome?
Well, there are lots of reasons that we outline in the book, but fundamentally there are people who have what we call Sentinel Intelligence. They are the watchdogs. They can't help it. They're born with this condition where they ask, what could go wrong? And they're constantly scanning the horizon and looking around the corner to see what could go wrong. And we just have to have some sensitivity to those people. Because if they are experts in their field and they're data-driven and they're giving us that warning, it's possible that they're right, even though the other experts haven't caught up with them yet. And we really need a mechanism in all of our institutions, but particularly at the national level and at the UN level, to give some credence to those warnings and to test them.
Now, of course, there have been plenty of false warnings: worldwide famine, swine flu, Y2K. What distinguished those fake Cassandras from the ones who were right from the start?
Well, in the case of worldwide famine, overpopulation, and the case of the early flu warnings in the Ford administration, the people who were taking the facts developed by experts and blowing them up and advertising them and running around saying there's a crisis, those people were not experts in the field, and they exaggerated the problem. So I don't think they actually were false Cassandras. I don't think they were Cassandras at all. In the case of Y2K, you have an example where we had a president who listened to the Cassandra and authorized a massive response, a preventative response. And I think had that not been done, we would have had a problem. The reason we didn't have a problem when the millennium rolled over, the reason our computers didn't fail, was we spent the 2 years prior to that changing all the computer code.
Do you think it is the role of the federal government to catalog and assess every possible threat?
Well, not every possible threat, but I think you have to ask, if the federal government doesn't do it, who's doing it? It needs to be done at some level. I think the federal government has responsibilities for security threats, and I think it has responsibilities for financial threats and public health threats. So that's pretty much all of the big ones.
And before we let you go, I guess we're kind of putting you on the spot, but of all the doomsday disasters waiting to happen, Russia, cybersecurity, rising sea levels, what are you most concerned about?
I come back to Jim Henson and sea level rise. That is the most profound change that I could imagine. If the United States has to spend trillions of dollars to defend its coastal cities against inundation of the seas, we won't have resources to do anything else.
Okay. Richard Clarke, co-author with R.P. Eddy, Warnings, Finding Cassandras to Stop Catastrophes, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Richard, we do appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure,
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Political analyst Dante Chinni explains that typical Trump voters are not economically hurting as much as people think, but more than they are used to. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The self-described geniuses of Wall Street are being stupid again. In 2007, their stupid schemes and frauds crashed our economy, destroying middle-class jobs, wealth, and opportunities. Far from being punished, however, the scofflaws were bailed out by their Washington enablers. So the moral lesson they learned was clear. Stupid pays. Go stupid. Sure enough, here they come again. Rather than investing America's capital in real businesses to generate grassroots jobs and shared prosperity, Wall Street is siphoning billions of investment dollars into speculative nonsense, such as bundles of high-risk subprime auto loans. It works like this. Car dealers, eager to goose up sales, hawk new vehicles to lower-income people, offering quick loan approval even to those with poor credit ratings. Banks, eager to hook more people on monthly car payments, okay these subprime car loans without verifying the buyer's ability to pay. Then, a Wall Street bank's investment house buys up thousands of these iffy individual loans, bundles them into multi-million-dollar debt securities, and sells them to wealthy global speculators. Last year alone, banks sold $26 billion worth of these explosive bundles of car loans. This is a gaseous repeat of Wall Street's subprime mortgage bubble that burst a decade ago. The scam generates easy money at the start for speculators and banksters, but as more and more low-income buyers are unable to make their car payments, defaults build up and the whole financial bubble pops. This is Jim Hightower saying, wasting America's much-needed investment capital on a scheme that intentionally puts people in cars they can't afford with loans they can't repay is not only stupid, but immoral, and is killing our economy. Why are we letting elite Wall Street loan sharks do this to us?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. What kind of presidential candidate should the Democrats nominate in 2020? Political analyst Dante Chinni says someone who is experienced, level-headed, and not a bore. And we say hello to Dante Chinni, who runs the American Communities Project at George Washington University, also writes the Politics Counts blog for the Wall Street Journal, and is the author of the book, Our Patchwork Nation. Dante Chinni, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Nice to talk with you again. With each passing outrage committed by President Trump, is his base of voters still intact?
Well, I mean, I guess it's how you define the Trump base is the question. But looking at the data the way I do, the places that were really looking at the way I kind of define his base is places that voted for Trump, that gave him a bigger margin than, or more vote than they gave to Romney. Back in 2012, and I think in those places he's still doing fairly well. I mean, he's seeing now if you're defining his base as everybody who voted for him, the numbers suggest that he's seeing some support fall away, particularly from better educated, wealthier Republican communities. But on the whole, if we're thinking about his base as this kind of core blue-collar, populist Republican group of voters, I think he actually seems like he is still doing fairly well with them, just going by the numbers.
If Republicans ever wake up and realize that Trump is a disaster for them, my words, as well as the rest of the country, who do you suspect might be the party's nominee in 2020?
God, that's such an interesting question. I mean, because it's I have no idea what it would look like at this point. Because look, I just wrote about this recently, like for my website, and I can identify at least 5 different elements to the GOP right now, and they're not all equally sized. Some are bigger than others, but then it's a question of how do they turn out when it comes to primaries, but. They're distinct parts of the party. There still is a national security part of the Republican Party. There still is kind of the Main Street establishment part of the party. There's the evangelical kind of social conservative part of the GOP. There's this kind of rural Trump support that's spread all across the country and rural counties. And then there's this group that really swung heavily to him in these kind of blue-collar suburban areas throughout the industrial Midwest. Those 5 elements are really different, and they want really different things. So what would it look like if for some reason he decided I'm not going to run again, or something happens that he walks away? I don't know. I mean, it would be fascinating to watch because, look, we did have the 2016 primary process went on and on and on, and it was a knockdown, drag-out. But I think that, it would be different because if Trump were to walk away, you're not going to have somebody that has that kind of built-in kind of stardom that he has, and the way he could just basically suck control of the narrative. I don't think you'd get that as much. So what would it look like? I have no idea who the nominee would be, and it would be a really fascinating kind of exercise to watch the party try to figure out, like, what does it really stand for? Because I do think that's a question that really is difficult to answer right now.
As I'm listening to you answer the question, I'm thinking to myself, 2020 may end up being really boring because this was the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen in my life. I mean, that,
Well, I think we could handle some boredom right now. Boredom wouldn't be a bad thing. It's because right now it's just every day. It's just you wake up and you read a tweet, and all of a sudden the news cycle looks different than you thought it was going to look. So boredom wouldn't necessarily be bad, but you're right. Compared to what we've been through, it's probably will look. If there's no Trump running in 2020, it would look more boring and perhaps a little more normal.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. We're speaking to Dante Chinni, runs the American Communities Project at George Washington University, writes the Politics Counts blog for the Wall Street Journal, and, of course, is author of the book Our Patchwork Nation. Dante, a lot of political observers make excuses or even apologies for the Trump base as people who were hurt by the American economy. But aren't they actually better off economically than most people think, yet perhaps consumed by a variety of social prejudices?
Well, so this is a really interesting question, and I've had a lot of people kind of tweet back and forth with me about this. And look, there's a group of people who voted for Donald Trump, a group of communities, the way I look at it at the county level, who voted for Donald Trump. They really have not done very well, and they are struggling. And he was promising something new to them, and that's the reason they came out. But there is also this group of people who really aren't doing terribly. They're just not doing as well as they used to be doing. They used to be. There's again these kind of blue-collar suburbs throughout the industrial Midwest. What's happened to them really is they're still hovering around kind of the average U.S. median household income, but they used to be far above it. So in some ways of looking at it, it's relative, right? Are their lives, are communities, lives in those communities really awful? Is it wretched? No, but it's not like it used to be, and that can drive a lot of anger. Now, on the, when you talk about social prejudices, I mean, those are different individual questions, and it's going to go from community to community, and like what pushes voters along. But I do think the idea that just writing off the economic stuff. Some people voted for Trump because he was the Republican candidate, and they vote for the Republican. And some people voted for Trump for these economic reasons. And look, there's a segment of the Republican vote that votes because of social prejudices. I would argue that on the left also there are Democrats that vote for social reasons too. And I spent a lot of time going to different communities around the country, and there are the social prejudices in the United States do really run both ways in some ways. And I'm not talking about Democrats or liberals being anti any ethnic group, but they do sometimes look at Trump voters and those communities and kind of just basically throw their hands up in the air and say, there's no way in heck I'm going to understand this place. And I think that's a mistake too. I mean, the goal should be, and it's bad when you talk about making apologies or excuses. That's wrong. But the idea of looking for explanations as to why people do what they do, that's the way I look at it. And I don't like to throw around words like the racism or class warfare or anything like that. I just look at the numbers and I try to understand what the heck is actually going on. And when I look at the data, I see people who feel like they're getting, if not the short end of the stick, a shorter end of the stick than they used to. And I do think that's definitely part of what happened with the Trump vote.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of people that were on the fence that were at one time Democrats, or at least probably just sat there in the middle and have felt like they've been left behind over the last several years. So I'm certain that certainly plays a role. You recently wrote about the role of the press, and I think most Americans do believe the media play an important watchdog role. But there was an interesting split in that survey. What was it, and how do you explain it?
It's actually really fascinating. If you look at public opinion about the watchdog role over time, it changes with who's in office. So now I will say, on the whole, Democrats do tend to favor the watchdog role more than Republicans do. So meaning when there's a Republican in office, Democrats favor watchdog more than Republicans do. When there's a Democrat in office, Republicans favor the watchdog role more than Democrats do, right? It flips depending on who's in charge. But Democrats do tend to be, if you ask them, do they think it's necessary? It tends to stay above 50%. It just bounces up and down. The Republican numbers, I think, right now have, and particularly under President Trump, the numbers are surprisingly low. They're in favor of the watchdog role, and there is a feeling, I think, among Trump voters that the president is under siege, and he's under siege by a media that doesn't like him, doesn't think he should be there, and I would say also this extends beyond just the media and Democrats. Trump voters would argue, this extends to what they would call, quote unquote, the establishment. And they don't like it. So for them, they view the watchdog role as something that's getting in the way of their candidate getting what he needs to get done. And the other thing I would say is, the kind of the turbulence that's surrounded the Trump administration. Some of these voters are in favor of this. Like, they brought him here to make things turbulent. They voted for him because they wanted him to make things, people are uncomfortable. They would say, good. They should be uncomfortable. That's what they sent him here to do. Now, the problem they would have, I think, is the accomplishments have been few and far between, and that's been a real challenge for them, for this White House. But I think the general turbulence that the media is all exercised about, and it has been absolutely fascinating to watch happen, to watch kind of work its way through the system. A lot of these Trump voters would say that's okay in their minds. They're fine with that. And some of the stuff you guys are latching onto, that's just you're just getting in the way of them getting what they need to get done.
Where does it come from? Why does it seem that conservatives just hate the mainstream media?
Well, so that's a really good question, and hate's a strong word, and I think that they think that the mainstream media and the establishment are not with them. I really do think that that's what a lot of this is about. Like, they think that, and go talk to people. I mean, you can be. I've talked to people in different communities, and I've been, look, I went to college. That's why I do what I do. And I've been criticized for having gone to college, and it's because I can't understand the plight that some of these people has happened to me when I was in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, which is up in Luzerne County near Wilkes-Barre. And their dislike of the mainstream media, and I don't know if he disliked me personally, but felt like I couldn't do the job right, was because you just don't understand. You people, is the way he'd say it, you people in Washington and New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and probably Philadelphia, I'm sure in his mind, don't understand what our lives are like. And, you're too busy covering this stuff, and you're not covering what's been happening to us out here. That's the way this is viewed, I think, by now this is not all conservatives. This is a particular brand, I think, of Trump supporters that are really like this. And they view the mainstream media as part of, quote unquote, the problem in America, and that's why they see it the way they do. And it's disappointing. I do think if Hillary Clinton had won and the media had gone after her, which they would have because that's their job, I think that those same Trump voters, I don't know, they might feel that the media's not going after her hard enough, but they would have to at least acknowledge that they're doing their job, which is to go after, not to go after, but to forcefully cover whoever's in the White House. And this is their guy in there. So right now they're really, really unhappy with the fact that, he's getting coverage that he's not used to. I think Trump isn't used to. And this is their guy, and they don't appreciate their guy being beaten up by the, establishment, the mainstream press.
Then tell him to put his phone down.
It is. A lot of them do say it is interesting. A lot of people will say but he does have to stop tweeting. The thing that they will tell you is, he really does have to stop tweeting. Even his supporters.
I was talking to a conservative friend of mine, and he said, if he would just shut up. If he would just shut up, everything would be fine. I said, well, I don't know if everything would be fine, but it probably would be better. He'd probably be over 40.
It's not in his nature. I mean, he's a pugilist at heart. I mean, he's the wrong. That's not going to happen. You just want to tell him. And I think that everybody is coming to terms with that. It's like, well, this just isn't going to go away. This is going to be part and parcel of how the White House runs while Trump is there. So, buckle up, people.
Yeah. Okay. Before we let you go, we'll have to bring out. Well, actually, we'll talk about something now, and we'll talk about something to the future. What do you think of the Democrats' new Better Deal program? Substance or mere slogan?
Well, I mean, it's a slogan as of right now. I think that the substance of it will, they're not going to be able to implement anything on it right now. I do think this idea that, look, what's really happened, if you look what's happened in the country economically, is there are people with different levels of education who really it is tougher to make a living, and the jobs are tougher to come by. And look, we're just at the beginning of this. If we get to the point where we really have automated truck driving, right? If we have robots driving trucks, I mean, that is going to be a massive hit to a sector, a segment of the population and a segment of the economy that uses that to make a living. These are real concerns. So, the stuff that they're trying to talk about in here and helping people and trying to reach out and help some of these folks that really are kind of being left behind, that's a good idea. Now, how do you do it? It's hard. It's really hard because, again, I grew up outside Detroit. I watched this happen for 20 years. And, we knew it was happening. We could see it happening. And the fact of the matter is we haven't been able to fix that. Like go to the plants now. Go to watch an assembly line and see how much of it's done by machinery. And, that's a hard pill to swallow in places where those places provided jobs. And so I hope it's more than just a slogan. We'll find out, I guess. But again, we're talking about stuff that sounds good in principle, but is very difficult to do in reality.
Okay. Now, crystal ball time. What kind of candidate should the Democrats put forward in 2020?
Well, let's see who's running, first of all, right? I mean, if Donald Trump runs again, let's just say if Donald Trump runs again, then I think if you're a Democrat, you need somebody who's forceful and who maybe can talk a little bit of the populist rhetoric, but who also can stay away from getting dragged into things, right? You don't want to get dragged into Twitter debates or tweet debates with this guy. You need to be able to stay away. And I think that what people are going to want if Donald Trump is running again, I think what you run against him is somebody who's experienced, somebody who really knows how Washington works, and you're going to use that as like, I'm going to explain to you how I'm going to get things done. I know how the system works, and I can work with it. And somebody who's level-headed, I would think that, but can't be a complete bore because Trump will run over them if it's Trump running against them. But somebody who's, and again, that's a tall order, but somebody who knows the way the system works, somebody who can, kind of get attention from the cameras, never as much as Trump, but some. And and somebody who I think comes across as just level-headed and calm. I think people are going to be ready for that if we go through 3.5 more years of kind of the White House running like this.
Oh boy, I can't even imagine 3.5 more years, but that's what's in front of us. Dante Chinni, who runs the American Communities Project at George Washington University, writes the Politics Counts blog for the Wall Street Journal, author of the book Our Patchwork Nation, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Dante, as always, we appreciate your time with us. Look forward to having you back again soon.
All right, Dave, thanks a lot.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher.
Hi, Mr. Mayor. Nice to see you.
Good to be with you, Bill.
I want you to pronounce the name of your city for me.
You did pretty good. It's Louisville.
Louisville.
Yeah, not bad.
I've never been there. I really want to come down, but I've always loved Louisville just because I love hearing people say it.
Well, come on down. Some people find it easier to say after they have a couple bourbons, which, there's a lot of in Louisville and Kentucky.
Well, one of our best friends is Congressman John Yarmouth.
Yes.
Who is head of the Bourbon Caucus.
Yes, which is a great bipartisan effort here. It's a good model for D.C.
Right. What did you think when you hear the president say to police officers, come on, don't be too nice to these people you're arresting?
Well, it's just so different from the reality of the street that we have to deal with. Police community relations are the number one thing of any mayor's got to be concerned with. We've forgotten somewhat in our series of civil unrest riots that we went through in the post-Ferguson world with all of the kind of drama that's been in Washington, D.C. But, the last one was in October in Charlotte, and a lot of that is when police community relations deteriorate. I mean, they signal a disconnection and hopelessness from the street. But, we have something called the Constitution. And that's really what the role of the police agency is to uphold the Constitution.
One thing that I see, Mr. Mayor, is I used to work for Governor Jerry Brown, his first time around. Okay, and on climate change, for example, Donald Trump says, no, we're going to get out of Paris and we're going to forget about this climate change. Jerry Brown is saying, oh, no, we're not. State by state by state, we're going to continue to do the right thing. The leadership, it seems to me, people are looking now more to governors and to mayors in this era of Trump to continue with the right policies. How do you see that for your city?
Well, there's no question about that. When you ask people what elected officials make the biggest difference in their life, it's usually the President of the United States and my mayor. Because
really? Yeah.
Because of the proximity to the reality of what's going on at the city level.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what most people are dealing with. They'd like the federal government to operate smoothly, but most people are just trying to get by. They're trying to make a living. So that's where the action's at. When it comes to climate change, for instance, too, I'm really proud of the mayors of the country. Almost 300 folks said, we're going to continue ahead with the Paris Accord, because we know clean air, clean water is what? It's good for business. If you're a serious employer and you're not responsible from an environmental standpoint, you're not going to get top talent. So mayors are proud to stand with the Accord and continue good environmental practices.
And you do that despite wherever the White House goes, wherever the Trump administration goes, right?
Well, so much of that's not meaningful to us and on the kind of the daily routine of how you build a great city.
Right. How about the issue of sanctuary cities? Is Louisville a sanctuary city?
No, we don't use that term. I mean, when you go and try to see what a sanctuary city is, there's no definition for that. We're a welcoming city is what we call ourselves. We're a growing international city. If someone is arrested, and we do a records check, if there is a problem with that, we notify the appropriate authorities, as we would if someone was native born as well. But we're a very broad, welcoming, growing global city.
One of the areas in which Kentucky was leading the nation, actually, with Connect and your state exchange under Obamacare. So I know how important this issue is to the residents of Kentucky. I'm sure to the residents of your community as well, or your city as well. What is Kentucky doing now? Here's another situation where the agenda for the Trump administration is to repeal Obamacare and replace it with, so far, nothing. How's Kentucky doing?
Well, since we passed Connect through former Governor Beshear, we have a new governor from a different political party, Governor Matt Bevin from Republican Party. So he's taken kind of a Trumpian approach toward health care. But I think what both President Trump are seeing and Governor Bevin are seeing is it's not a real popular move to be taking away people's health care.
Yeah,
Over
right.
500,000 Kentuckians received health care as a result of the Affordable Care Act, 100,000 Louisvillians as well.
Under Connect.
Right. Yes. So, which is the Affordable Care Act,
Mm-hmm.
Obamacare, what have you. Now, it's funny, when you call it Obamacare, it wasn't very popular in Kentucky. When you called it Connect, all of a sudden it became popular, although Obamacare is real popular now with everybody.
Well, that's one thing that Trump has accomplished, or the Republicans have. They've suddenly made Obamacare popular. Right?
But dynamics shift, too. One of the big issues in the country in the last 2 years, especially in the eastern United States, is this increase in the use of opioids and addiction. What Medicaid, what the Affordable Care Act has done in terms of treatment for opioid addiction is hugely important to the cities of America. And you saw that play out in the whole health care debate over the past couple of weeks. So it is critical that no matter what direction we go with health care, we need to not just keep the coverage we have, but extend the coverage. And I tell you, Bill, to me, this is really symptomatic of Washington, D.C. We're talking about the wrong thing. We're talking about all these policy issues. We should be talking about cost here. So I'm a business person. As you know, we spend 18% of our GDP as a country on health care. The United Kingdom, 8%, Germany, 10%, and they have universal coverage. So what we should be talking about is rationalizing costs so we can get out redundancy in this so we can cover everybody in the country and then have money left over. That's really where the conversation should be.
Is that an argument for single payer?
Well, they're certainly trending that way. You take a look at the VA system. Humana's headquartered in Louisville. They're big in the government system as well. So, we're having to think through in our country a lot of these issues, and with the inability in D.C. for us to come together on regular order and kind of work these things as problems. So hopefully that will take place. You saw what Senator Lamar Alexander announced yesterday with Patty Murray saying this is how we should be doing business. These are big, hairy problems, whether it's health care, education, welfare, whatever. Why don't we have an adult conversation about it? Because the reality is at the city level, we deal with the consequences of all this every day. We're not waiting for help from Washington, but it would be nice to see some rational business taking place here.
Isn't it it's almost surprising? I mean, these people, like Orrin Hatch has been around a long time, Patty Murray's been around a long time, so's Mitch McConnell, that you would think that this is where they, with an issue like health care, this is where they would have started, right? Yeah. Saying, all right, obviously the system is not perfect, right? Let's just sit down and figure out where the problems are and how we can make this system work better in a bipartisan way. They would have been way ahead of the game by now if they'd started that way.
Well, you're right, and that's how mayors naturally
you have to
act,
right?
Because we deal with reality.
Yeah,
we might wish things weren't a certain way, but we have to deal with the way that they are. So when we get together at the United States Conference of Mayors or on this trip here to D.C., it's like, what's happening? How are we going to deal with it? People don't have time for theories. Most folks are just struggling to get by. It doesn't matter if they're in a city. It doesn't matter if they're in a county, in a rural area, urban area. They say, can you take care of these obstacles for me so I can have a better life for me and my kids?
Right. How long have you been mayor there in Louisville?
6.5 years.
6.5 years. So you've been reelected, right?
Reelected and running for a third and final term.
Is that right? All right. Good for you. You must be doing something right.
Well, I'm a business guy that just happens to be mayor, as I say. And to be a good mayor, you have to have the head of a chief executive officer and the heart of a social worker. I mean, it takes it both.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, and a good combination. So, what do you find with the people there? And I'm sure it's true across the nation. Are the most important issues that you're facing, the biggest challenges that you've got as mayor?
Well, it's always public safety, jobs, education. Healthcare is now a big part of the debate as well. Fortunately, our economy is rolling very well. Education achievements were at all-time highs. So we're doing great in the macro picture. But the question for cities like Louisville and for the whole country is, how's everybody doing? Does everybody feel like they've got an on-ramp to success in today's world? And the dynamics have changed so dramatically in terms of speed, rapidly changing global technology-based world versus what was 20 or 30 years ago. And so the ability for a big portion of our population, whether it's in cities or in our rural areas, to feel connected and hopeful for the future is really being strained right now. And so that leads to lack of social mobility. It leads to inequality in terms of wealth and income. These are the big issues of the day that are stretching our country. And I referred previously to the civil unrest and the riots that were taking place post-Ferguson. Those were precipitated by an officer-involved shooting. But what the street was saying was, I feel hopeless and disconnected. What happened in the last election with President Trump? Our rural areas were saying, I feel hopeless and disconnected. So there's common ground between those two areas that look at each other right now and say, I don't have anything in common with the urban poor or the rural poor. We're concerned about the same thing. So when you put on your optimistic hat, if we can come up with the country as a way to figure out how to upskill everybody, how to get decent wages and health care in every household, we've got a real shot. It's amazing how well we do as a country with all of these problems that we talk about every day.
Right. Do you find it hard to operate as a Democratic mayor in a red state?
No, I mean, what you're seeing in 30-plus states now, Bill, is you're seeing red states with blue cities. So, and the blue cities are getting even bluer. 90% of the people live in cities. 95% of the GDP growth comes from cities. So cities are where it's happening. But you also, like in a state like Kentucky, our partnership with our rural areas is very important. We do that through local food. We do that through something, you're going to think I'm joking here, called bourbonism, which is bourbon travel.
Right. Yeah.
You know, people go to Napa Valley for wine, so now they're flooding by the millions to Louisville and Kentucky to be bourbon tourism. So what that does, it connects the food, culture, the agricultural traditions of the rural areas with the city. So those partnerships are important because nobody's going to win this game in America if we keep dividing rural, urban, black, white, Muslim, Christian. Cities are able to pull that together and then partner with our rural areas, so everybody's got to feel like they got a path forward.
And do you find Mitch McConnell's open to that approach? You're a senior senator?
Well, he's got a different set of issues he's working on. What we do see, from a mayor's perspective, the more that you move up to, let's say, the state capitol, Congress, U.S. Senate, the more removed people get from reality. Now, your congressional delegation is pretty close to action. Right. But as a U.S. Senator, you don't get your hands very dirty with what the real problems are of your constituents. And many of them, they float around in bubbles that are protected and designed to keep people away from them. You got to know what reality is to make good politics.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Richard Clarke, Dante Chinni, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.